Let me preface my remarks on naturalism by saying something about the place of naturalism as a philosophy in American thought. It would not be correct to regard naturalism as indigenous to America in the sense that it is part of the long tradition of American thought since the founding of this country. On the contrary, the main winds of doctrine in this country have been strongly anti-naturalistic. On the other hand, it would be also incorrect to regard naturalism as an importation from foreign climes. Naturalism is a philosophy, if you like, an attitude toward the world and human society, which has been developed because of the experience, particularly the experience that results from the development of science and the application of technology to various areas of human experience. Naturalism is a philosophy which very frequently, if not always, is generated by this type of experience. And so, while the actual career of naturalism as a philosophy in America is perhaps not older than 50, 75 years, it is now deeply rooted in the experience of this country, and it has, moreover, a background of thought which goes back at least 2,000 years to the time of the Greeks. One thing I think it is safe to say is that naturalism is not a modern philosophy in the sense that it has been developed in response to some very particular discoveries in the sciences, but rather it is an attitude towards the world and man's place in it, which has been repeatedly rediscovered by reflective men who have considered what their own powers are and how they can exercise them and under what conditions they can exercise them in the cosmos in which we are born. So naturalism has a very long history and has a great number of very distinguished exponents of it. In ancient times, for example, Aristotle in many respects can be counted as a naturalist. The Roman poet Lucretius, the Spanish, Dutch, Jewish thinker Spinoza, the Englishman John Stuart Mill of the last century, the Spanish-American thinker George Santayana, and then most recently perhaps the foremost exponent of naturalism in this country was John Dewey. It is well to remember that naturalism, although the name is frequently used, covers a great variety of views which are themselves not always compatible. For example, there have been some naturalists who have regarded naturalism as a form of religion or religious thought. There are some naturalists who have been entirely non-religious, if not anti-religious. There have been some naturalists, such as Spinoza, for example, who profess the belief in God, although, to be sure, it's a notion of divinity which was distinctive of Spinoza himself and was really miles apart from the theological commitments of the traditional religions. So I like to emphasize at the very beginning, because obviously I couldn't possibly talk about every variety of naturalism. They all have something in common, and my presentation of naturalism as a philosophical doctrine will have to be highly selective. Now, the word naturalism itself obviously is derived from the word nature, and the word itself, the word nature itself has a very large number of different senses, sometimes obscure, sometimes clear. You may remember, if you ever read Charles Dickens' Nicholas Nickleby, in a very interesting scene somewhere toward the end of the book, a runaway boy had been caught by the schoolmaster of the school where he'd been placed by a man who was his father, whose identity was kept secret throughout most of the book, placed in this school really with deliberate purpose that the boy would be so mistreated that he wouldn't survive. He ran away, he was caught, and brought to a man who pretended to be his father, a man by the name of Snawley. And then this brief conversation that I would like to read to you is a scene where Snawley remarks about his attitude towards this boy who had been just returned to him. "What was it," said Snawley, "that made me take such a striking interest in him when that worthy instructor of youth, the schoolmaster of this school, brought him to my house? What was it that made me burn all over with a wish to chastise him severely for cutting away from his best friends, his pastors and masters?" "It was parental instinct, sir," observed Squeers, the name of the schoolmaster. "That's what it was, sir," rejoined Snawley. "The elevated feeling, the feeling of the ancient Romans and Grecians, and of the beasts of the field and birds of the air, with the exception of rabbits and tomcats, which sometimes devour their offspring. My heart yearned towards him. I don't know what I couldn't have done to him in the anger of a father." "It only shows what nature is," said Mr. Squeers. "She's a rum one, is nature." "She's a holy thing, sir," remarked Snawley. "I believe you," added Mr. Squeers with a moral sigh. "I should like to know how we should ever get on without her. Nature," Mr. Squeers said solemnly, "is more easier conceived than described. Oh, what a blessed thing, sir, to be in a state of nature." Now, a careful examination of this passage and its way in which Squeers talks about nature indicates that he himself is using the word in a variety of different senses. I won't pretend to enumerate all of the senses. A very distinguished American philosopher, no longer alive, the late Arthur Lovejoy, wrote a paper in which he distinguished something like 25 different senses of the word nature. But I would like to call your attention to two senses of the word, two important senses, which I think will play some role in the discussion this evening. In the first place, we sometimes use the word nature in the sense of talking about the nature of a thing, for example, the nature of a table, or the nature of copper, or the nature of electron, or the nature of electricity, or the nature of the sun. And if we ask, what do we mean when we talk about the nature of a thing? The answer, I think, would have to be, well, what we have in mind are the various capacities or powers that the thing has, which can be usually formulated by way of laws. So, for example, if one asks, well, what is the nature of electricity? At least part of the answer is to say electricity is a process which is accompanied by the development of a magnetic field, it generates heat, and so on. And these would be certainly stable properties of this process, which can be formulated in general laws. So we sometimes talk about the nature of a single thing or of a class of things. Sometimes, however, we use the word nature in a more inclusive sense. Nature consisting of the totality of the various powers and properties of all things whatsoever. This is one sense of the word nature, namely the sense in which we're talking about the stable properties and characteristics of things, of all things whatsoever, which can be codified and formulated in more or less complicated laws. But there's another sense of the word nature, namely the sense in which we contrast what is part of nature as what is original compared with what is artificial. And so while in the first sense that I've enumerated, namely the sense in which we talk about nature as consisting of the totality of all powers that are found anywhere in the universe or the cosmos, in that sense, a musical composition is part of nature, man's activities are parts of nature, man himself is a part of nature. In the second sense, namely where you contrast what is natural with what is artificial, or what is a work of art, a painting would not be called natural, a moral code would not be called natural, because it is the product of human artifice and deliberation and construction. Now, it's important to keep these two different senses of the word nature in mind, namely the sense of an inclusive totality of powers and capacities on the one hand, and nature in the sense of something which is original, unintended as the result of human exercise of deliberation and activity, where nature is contrasted with what is artificial. And I will want to use the word nature in the main, and I will signalize it when I depart from this, using the word nature in the inclusive sense, in the first sense, where man himself would be regarded as being part of nature, man's works themselves are part of nature, even though they are the product of human artifice and choice and creative activity. Now, there are three components in naturalism as a philosophy which I would like to talk about. Naturalism, I think, contains, first of all, or provides a general account of the world of the cosmos. Secondly, it offers a view of the nature of the character of human knowledge. And thirdly, it offers a conception of man's place in the universe and of what the human good consists of. Now, I want to say something about each of these within the time that is available. Let me first then turn to the conception of the world which is basic to almost every form of naturalism, at least with which I'm familiar. There are, I think, two main tenets in the doctrine of naturalism as far as its account of the general features of the cosmos. The first, and I'm sure this will remind you of many other philosophies which are formulated somewhat in this fashion, the first and perhaps most important feature of dictum of naturalism or belief of naturalism is that organized matter is the only thing that has a causal efficacy, that organized matter is existentially and causally prior to everything else. Whatever the matter might consist of. The matter might be electrons, the matter might be molecules, the matter might be the materials out of which a piece of wood is made, a piece of furniture, a copper wire. These are material things. They're material in the sense that they have a spatio-temporal location. And the central tenet of naturalism is that whenever you have causes operating in the world, the causes are always issuing from something that we would recognize or identify in some fashion or other as organized material or organized matter. Let us remind ourselves of some views which today I suppose are in the main taken as matter of course, not only in the physical sciences such as physics or chemistry, but also in biology, that the development of the individual organism from the initial fertilized egg to the adult individual, or the development of a race or of a species, is to be accounted for not in terms of the operation of disembodied forms or spirits which have a reality independent of the various bits of organized matter with which we associate such things as purposes and whatnot, but that the entire account of the development of the biological individual as well as the development of the race is given entirely in terms of, if you like, forces which are physico-chemical in origin, even though they become complicated and take on various forms which are not found in all aspects of nature. That is, it is now taken almost as a matter of course among most biologists that you don't require for the understanding of biological processes the introduction of something that we might call a special vital force, but that it is sufficient for the purposes of understanding living forms or organisms in general is some understanding of the organization of some kind of material substructure. Now, the primary tenet of naturalism, I repeat, is this conviction that the only forces that are operative in any part of the universe are forces which are associated with organized bodies, and that the supposition that there are goals or ends or forms or spirits which are not associated with organized material, but which themselves are supposedly are agents in their own realization, that this is a conception that is ruled out not on the ground that it would be absurd to suppose that there are such things, but on the ground that all the evidence that we have been able to accumulate in modern science as well as in older forms of inquiry indicate that the introduction of such disembodied agencies really adds nothing to our understanding of what goes on. Now let me stop for a moment to raise one question. Many people have argued that naturalism, insofar as it maintains that there's this what I've called the causal primacy of organized matter, that this has been perhaps made questionable in the light of developments of modern physics, on the ground that if you consider what some of the fundamental entities are which current physics recognizes, it would be hard to say that these fundamental particles have a kind of a hard material core, that they are something like billiard balls, that they seem to be sort of evanescent, that they have an almost unimaginably short lifetime, that it is difficult in many cases to locate them, definitely in some region of space. And so a great many distinguished physicists themselves have maintained that naturalism, insofar as it subscribes to this view that the matter is something that is primary in the causal order of nature, that this is no longer a tenable view. Now, I would simply like to indicate very briefly one reason for believing that this interpretation of the development or the content of modern physics is really not justified. That while it would be very difficult to maintain that the conceptions of matter which were held 100, 200 years ago For example, the view that the world is made up of ultimate particles or atoms, which are sort of little billiard balls, much smaller but hard, that these are the ultimate particles. This is surely not a view that can be maintained today. Nevertheless, if you examine what are today regarded as being the fundamental elements of physics, they too have some kind of a spatio-temporal location. They too are to be understood in terms of more or less stable properties that they exhibit. They too are to be understood not in terms of what we might call spiritual forces, not in terms of goals or purposes or desires which are supposedly exhibited by these fundamental particles, but to be understood in the same way in which one understands the behavior of the planetary system, namely in terms of certain characteristics which are associated with our today regarded as being fundamental particles, and the laws which relate their mutual interactions. Now, after all, it doesn't make any difference what the particular character of the material substance is that is accepted as the latest account of what are the basic elements of the world. The point is that even if you take a more macroscopic view of things, for example, if you consider the behavior of billiard balls on a billiard table, or the behavior of objects falling from a height, or the behavior of the planets, or the behavior of the tides, after all, we understand these things not in terms of the operation of vital forces, of vital entelechies, of things that have a disembodied existence, but in terms of the operations of these material things themselves. Let me also offer one other explanation. You might say, well, and how does naturalism differ from what is sometimes called materialism? For example, in ancient Greece, Democritus had the idea that the ultimate constituents of everything that exists consists of atoms. He believed that they had various shapes and that they hooked into one another, and in this way the macroscopic objects somehow were created. He was a materialist, at least in the sense in which he ascribed primacy to the operation of these fundamental atoms, allegedly indivisible and ultimate, couldn't break them up in any way. On the other hand, Democritus took one view which I think is foreign to naturalism. Namely, Democritus believed that the only thing that is real, the only thing that exists, is matter. So, in a famous passage in one of the fragments that was left, that has survived, he says, well, by custom we call something sweet, or some things bitter. By custom some things are red, and some things are white. But these qualities that we apprehend through the organs of vision, these are not really real, that in the end and ultimately the only things that are real are the atoms and the void or the empty space in which they move. That is, it is distinctive of materialism, of which Democritus is an example, as well as of later forms of materialism, to maintain that the only real thing in the universe is matter. Now, naturalists don't say this. Naturalists affirm the primacy of matter, but they do not deny that qualities, that thought, that emotions, which themselves are not material, although they are the manifestation of material organizations, naturalists maintain that qualities, relations, thinking, emotions, desires, hopes, that these are real. The one thing that naturalism, however, maintains, that though real, they don't have causal efficacy. They do not have a causal power. They do not exercise compulsion. If a man thinks, it isn't that his thought has no value, but his thought is operative in the universe only insofar as the thought is exhibited by an organized living organism, and it is the operations of the living organism constructed in very complicated and subtle ways, which is one of the elements that accounts for the changes that take place, at least in the human scene and perhaps in the non-human environment as well. And so one of the prime doctrines that is associated with this is that, well, surely we can talk about human personality and regard one individual's personality as being more desirable or superior to that of another. But one thing that naturalism will have to deny is that there is such a thing as the survival of personality after the corruption of the human body. So the first tenet, the first component in this doctrine, let me refer to, for the sake of brevity, as the causal primacy of matter, not of undifferentiated matter, not of matter in a lump, but of certain kinds of organized matter. After all, a molecule itself is an organization of atoms. A living cell is an organization of molecules. A macroscopic body such as the human being is an organization of cells and tissues. It isn't a kind of a homogeneous material that is being organized. There are differences in the material that enter into the composition of various kinds of things, and the mode of organization itself is very different. This is a primary doctrine. The second component in the naturalistic outlook upon the world is connected with the first, but it can be distinguished from the first. Namely, naturalism maintains that there is a diversity, a plurality of different things, and that the differences, for example, between red and blue, between hard and soft, between sweet and sour, between the organization of a human being, the organization of a cat, that these are genuine differences, that these differences between them are not simply appearances which themselves are not real, that they are not appearances which in some way cloak some ultimate homogeneous reality which is somehow remains unknowable. That is, a fundamental tenet in naturalism is not only the primacy of matter, but the variety of different things that we find in human experience, and that this variety is irreducible, and you can't explain it away. It's something that you have to recognize and operate with, even though you can try to explain them in terms of the way in which constituent parts of highly organized bodies enter into the organization. Now, there are several consequences of this emphasis upon the plurality or diversity of the things that we encounter in the world, namely that while there are obviously connections between things, that things are not independent of one another. For example, the behavior of a planet is certainly contingent upon its proximity to the sun. The temperature on a planet's surface depends upon its relation to the sun. There are definite laws about the behavior of planets and of other organized bodies. For example, if you think of familiar gravitational formula that all bodies attract each other in accordance to a certain relation of the distances between them, that these are relations between things, but that these relations are not logically necessary. They are there, but that they are in what is philosophers sometimes refer to, that the relations are only contingently present, not necessarily present. And let me just say a word in explanation of this. if one were to ask, is the cardinal number 5 less than, equal to, or greater than the number 3? Of course, we would all agree that 5 is greater than 3. Now, about the statement that 5 is greater than 3, I think we would, perhaps all of us, recognize that this is a necessary truth. It is logically necessary. Logically necessary in the very simple sense that anybody who denies it would involve himself in a self-contradiction. That it would be logically impossible for 5 to be other than being greater than 3. On the other hand, if you consider the laws of physics, if one were to consider, for example, the gravitational formula, or other laws, such as that in a gas, if the temperature is constant and the pressure on the gas is increased and the volume diminishes, these are constant relations that one finds in a gas. While these relations actually hold, they don't hold as a matter of logical necessity, because it is at least conceivable logically that things might have been different from what they are. Now, I emphasize this point because, as a consequence of the logical contingency of the laws of nature, of the laws of physics, of chemistry, of biology, that none of them is logically necessary, that the universe itself does not form one coherent, unified, logical pattern, so that everything that happens at one place is dependent completely upon what happens at any other place, dependent in a logical sense. That the course of historical development does not fall into a simple pattern corresponding, for example, to the way in which, if one were to ask for finding an approximate value, let's say to the square root of 2, and a little elementary mathematics tells us, well, of course we cannot give you a precise value for the square root of 2, but we'll give you a series of approximations. And the approximation begin like this. Well, 1 is an approximation. A better approximation is 1.4. A still better approximation is 1.41. A still better approximation is 1.414, and so on. You can continue this process endlessly. Now, each step in this series of approximation to the square root of 2 is logically inevitable. It couldn't be otherwise than it is. On the other hand, the course of history in the universe doesn't fall into that kind of a schema. There are no logically necessary stages of development. That the development, for example, of human civilization doesn't follow one necessary pattern, one logically necessary pattern, that there are chance occurrences in at least one intelligible sense of chance, namely that not everything else is uniquely dependent logically upon everything else. Now, one consequence of this is that when people ask, as they sometimes do, why is there a world rather than nothing? Why is there something existing rather than nothing? They are looking for an answer to a question which I think one would have to say is really not an intelligible question at all. Because the question supposes now that you can give some ultimate logical explanation for everything that there is. Now, from the point of view of a naturalistic outlook upon the world, there are explanations for a great many things. If an individual, if a body falls from a height and hits the ground after a certain time and with a certain velocity, we can explain this. We can explain this, let's suppose, in terms of a theory of gravitation. If we say, well, now, why should the law of gravitation hold? We can try to explain this. We can explain this again in terms of general theory of relativity. But then you say, well, now, how about the theory of relativity? What's the explanation for that? Well, perhaps, although today we are not able to do this, we might be able to push back this thing still further and offer an explanation for that. But no matter how far you go, something is going to be left unexplained, in a sense that there will be no logically necessary reason for a thing being so. And so if you look at what is the character of the kind of explanations that we give, not in mathematics, mind you, but in the various branches of science, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, social science, ultimately we have to accept certain general laws, not because they are logically necessary truths, but because they are simply so, and there's ultimately no explanation for them. And even though there might be, we might push back the frontiers of knowledge and find an explanation for some particular law, we must stop at some point and say, well, now, here, this is something that we have to take without explanation, because there is no rational explanation for it at all. This is the character of things as they are. One further consequence of this emphasis upon plurality and diversity is that if we examine various aspects of the world, we find that there are different kinds of organized bodies. There are certain organized bodies, for example, such as human beings, which exhibit a kind of a purposive activity. And this is a result of the kind of organization that characterizes the human body. In the case of the human body, we not only have certain self-regulative mechanisms, such as, for example, that the temperature of the blood remains more or less constant within limits. That if you go out on a cold day, somehow the body manages to maintain a certain average stable temperature. That is, there are certain self-regulative mechanisms in the human body which maintain a certain steady state. Now, this is not done because the body itself has deliberate purposes, but because of the kind of organization that characterizes human bodies. And the same thing, of course, could be said about non-human organisms as well, that there are these self-regulative mechanisms, and that these are what are sometimes called teleological systems, that they are so contrived, so constructed, that certain end results maintain themselves. So the point to note, which every naturalist, it seems to me, has to recognize, that there are such purposive mechanisms in nature, self-regulative mechanisms in nature, which maintain the body in a certain state. On the other hand, there are also systems which are not self-regulative, which are not purposive, which are not teleological, which are not so constructed that they attempt to achieve some particular end. And again, if we think of the conditions under which living forms are to be found on our planet, we find there is certainly a certain kind of an adjustment between living organisms and the environment. A very famous physiologist of early years of the present century, the late Professor L.J. Henderson of Harvard, once wrote a very interesting book called The Fitness of the Environment, and he pointed out under what conditions living forms can maintain themselves on the surface of the globe, and at least the way in which human bodies are constructed. They wouldn't be able to come into existence unless the environment had certain properties and contained a certain kinds of chemical elements, unless the temperature were within certain limits, unless there were a certain kind of an atmosphere present, and so on. Now, it certainly does not mean that the earth was so created in order that living forms or living organisms should be able to live on it. Rather, that these conditions to which Henderson pointed out were limited conditions under which life can occur. at least life as we know it. And again, the supposition that the whole complex set of living organisms and the physico-chemical environment, that they themselves form as a totality some kind of a self-regulative system, is again something that has to be denied in the light of the evidence, because surely it is not inconceivable and it is not unlikely that it's going to happen sometime that the temperature of the earth be of such a kind that life as we know it would be impossible. And certainly much of the speculation today amongst astronomers and biologists as to whether there is life on other parts of the universe, which is highly debatable, and some distinguished biologists deny that it's very likely that this is to be the case, really are an attempt to discover whether the conditions under which life could occur exist in remote parts of the universe. We know, to be sure, very little about it, so speculation is easy, and confidence also is very easy to acquire, because at least at present, nobody can really check any of these results. The point I want to make in this connection is that while there are purposive processes in nature, while there is teleology in nature, it's a mistake to maintain that the cosmos as a whole, or nature as a whole, itself has a purpose, is developing in order to finally arrive at some pre-designated objective or goal. Now, I think all of these features that I've mentioned, they are really part of the background of human life, and the reason why it seems to me so important to mention these things is that it is against this kind of a background that we can really hope to appreciate the role and the place of man in nature. The human scene, on the basis of the best evidence that we have, is perhaps only temporary. Perhaps circumstances will change, whether because of our own folly or because of forces beyond our control, where the conditions for maintenance of either human or other kinds of life do not occur, and the human scene would be wiped out. Nevertheless, the human scene is a genuine part of nature. It is not an excrescence on nature. It's as genuine a part of nature as are the atoms and the stars. Now, there's a converse point to be made in this connection. The continuance of human beings depends upon the continuance of certain characteristics of the physical-chemical environment. And so many of the features of things that we find in non-living organized matter are also to be found in the human body. So, for example, the human body, like a cat's body or like a table, is made up of certain elementary particles which are related to one another in accordance with various laws which physicists and physiologists are interested in formulating. And so there's no doubt that many features that are to be found in the non-animate part of nature are also to be found in the human scene or the organics, among organic bodies. On the other hand, the converse doesn't in general hold. That is, that there are features to be found in the human scene, in the human body, which to the best of our knowledge are not to be found elsewhere in nature. You will notice that this is really a continuation of the theme that there is a certain fundamental diversity and irreducible variety in things, and many philosophers, many distinguished philosophers, have argued that, well, if man is part of nature, if man has somehow grown up in a world which has the character that we find it to have, this is so because the features, the characteristics that we attribute to human beings must in some incipient form be already present in inanimate nature. This kind of argument has sometimes been referred to as an argument from continuity. Yes, there are similarities between human beings and other animal forms, and these have certain points of resemblance between other forms of life, and so on. And the argument is, well, now there's a kind of a continuous development, and this continuous development, and the supposition that there's a continuity development has led many people to maintain, well, then this also means that such things as thoughts or emotions or passions, hates and loves and courage and whatnot, that these things that we find so prominently in the human scene must in some vague sense be also to be found in the most simple forms of creation, electrons, even the more elementary particles than that. For example, the late Teilhard de Chardin, in a book that has attracted a great many people, has argued that there must be a kind of a divine element in the construction of the universe, on the ground that the features that one finds characteristic of human beings couldn't have somehow developed out of nothing, that there must have been all these qualities which are present in a fairly distinct form in human beings must have been present in a less distinct form in inanimate matter, and that they will be exhibited even more fully and more distinctly in a final culmination of the evolutionary process. Now, this seems to me to be an argument, though it has won the concurrence of a great number of highly respected thinkers, seems to me to really to have no sure basis for it. That is, if you think, for example, somebody fires a gun at a rabbit and the rabbit is killed, well, surely you can trace the causal the causal path of the bullet from the gun to the rabbit. The rabbit, after it was been hit, exhibits a certain characteristic, and there is a causal continuity between the death of the rabbit and somebody's pulling of the trigger. But it would be absurd to maintain that the only way in which the rabbit could have died would have been on the supposition that there was death, in the literal sense, in the bullet which was sent out. That is, it doesn't follow that because there are these causal dependencies between the emission of the weight of the bullet and the speed with which it moves and the final denouement of the death of the rabbit, that therefore death must have been literally present in the origins which account for the outcome. And the argument from continuity can be very easily abused as if one were to say, well, of course, there's a continuous path going from the top of my head to the sole of my feet. There's no place where you can say, well, now, here there's a fundamental break between what belongs to my feet and what belongs to my head. And then if one were to abuse this argument from continuity, say, well, of course, then there's really no difference between the top of my head and the sole of my feet, which is surely arrant nonsense. And so let me hasten on and say, in conclusion about this general doctrine of naturalism, this is, of course, a theory about certain general features of the universe. It's a theory which is accepted by naturalists on the ground that the available evidence for it is overwhelming, that all our experience in various areas of human enterprise confirm it. This is confirmed by science as well as everyday affairs, and that the way of understanding nature is by trying to discover not some one uniform pattern of development which will somehow indicate what is the ultimate purpose to which all things are directed, but rather in recognizing the variety of different systems, the possibility of their interconnection, and the attempt to formulate what the laws of dependence are. That is, the kind of wisdom that naturalism offers is the kind of wisdom which Sir Isaiah Berlin, in a very interesting book on Leo Tolstoy a few years ago, the title of The Hedgehog and the Fox, said, characterized in this way. Well, see, the hedgehog is a creature that thinks that there's one big truth, and everything else somehow follows out of that, while the fox is a creature who didn't think that there was one big truth, but there are a lot of little truths. Naturalism is on the side of the fox, not on the hedgehog. That there are a great number of particular truths about the world and of man's place in it. There's no one big truth. The answer to, if we could only discover it, would solve all our problems. Let me turn much more quickly then to these other two things that I wanted to say something about, namely the conception of knowledge, which is characteristic of naturalism, and then something about man's place in nature, to which I've, as a matter of fact, already made some reference. Now, there are different ways in which men have tried in the past to understand the world about them. There have been simply the ways of simply falling back upon some kind of an authority, whether revealed or otherwise. There's a way of simply of perhaps reading tea leaves or reading palms. There are ways of appealing to self-evidence and saying, well, now certain truths about the world are whole because they're self-evidently so. One can indicate a whole variety of different ways in which people in the past, and I suppose today, still continue to think that they can find information and guidance about the kind of world that we're living in. On the other hand, there's also the method that is sometimes referred to as the method of science or scientific method, which is surely a way in which people have, and with great success, discovered something about the character of the world. Now, what is this method that we call the method of science? Well, after all, you can use highfalutin language in discussing it and characterizing it, and surely in a long discussion on scientific method one would have to make a great variety of different distinctions. But after all, it is a procedure that all of us, whether we have been trained in the sciences or not, learn to use in order to get around the common sense world of ordinary experience. That is, for example, if you meet an obstacle in the road, you'll have to do something about it. You will make a detour. If you want to cross a river without being wet, well, what do? Well, you build a bridge. You solve that paradox that way. If you want to have a child prosper physically, then you give it a certain amount of food. I mean, these things are discoveries that ordinary men have made long before the advent of what we call modern science, through the device of having ideas, suggestions, trying them out, seeing whether they conform to what careful observation indicates. And the method of science, though it can be highly developed, is really an extension of the methods that have been shown to be successful in the ordinary affairs of life, insofar as we learn how to control the environment. What is characteristic of scientific method in general is the use of some idea, some hypothesis, some conjecture as to what is the character or the laws controlling the behavior of things, and then subjecting that conjecture, that idea, that supposition, that guess, to a very careful check by seeing what follows from that assumption and comparing the consequences of an assumption with matters of observation, whether of the crude observation of ordinary of unaided senses, or the more refined observation that we are able to make because of the development of very subtle instruments of observation. But ultimately, the check upon every hypothesis, every proposal in the sciences, ultimate check is the concordance of the hypothesis with some with the results of careful and controlled and repeated observation which is eventually obtained through the various organs of sense. Now, this is the method of science, and the conception of knowledge that is characteristic of naturalism, that is, I will not say it's uniquely characteristic of naturalism, but it's certainly a central core in a naturalistic outlook on the world, is a commitment to the use of this logical experimental method in trying to understand what the nature of things is and what the place of man in the cosmos is. In short, and I'd like to emphasize this particularly, naturalism would systematically deny the validity of appeals to the self-evident as itself being a criterion of the truth of what is claimed to be self-evident. Self-evidence is at best a kind of a psychological category. Some things seem evident to some people and not to others. Many things that people have regarded as being self-evident at one time they've had to revise in the light of subsequent experience. There can be no claim to ultimate finality about our alleged knowledge about the various features of the world. Some claims to have knowledge about the world are better established than others, but all our claims as to what is the constitution of the world is subject to revision in the light of a continuance of this long-range process of checking our intellectual beliefs against the deliverances of experience. So it is a central feature of naturalism, the belief that claims to knowledge are corrigible, are subject to control and check, and that the procedure of achieving what we might call reliable beliefs is through the operation in more or less careful form, developed form of this method that is known as the method of science. And now let me turn much more hastily to the third component in naturalistic view, namely the conception that naturalism offers of man's place in nature. There have been a great number of thinkers who have supposed that in some way nature has been designed for the special delectation or the maintenance of the human species. And in the light of what I've said, surely this is not something that a naturalist can subscribe to. On the other hand, there have been very distinguished figures. For example, Bertrand Russell, in a very famous paper which I'm sure many of us must have read, and read with delight, as I have read it with delight, Russell's Free Man Worship, which he published when he was a young man some 60 years ago, in which he considers the place of man in nature, and he has this kind of image that, well, God is deciding to have a little sport, and so he creates the human scene, and then after a while he gets tired with this, and then has one star crash into our sun or into our planet, and things are destroyed. The general picture that Russell gives of the cosmos is that, well, human life is a constant war with nature in which there are evil forces always trying to get the better of the human scene. The conception, for example, that this is a terrible world, a terrible cosmos in which we are plunged, that there's a kind of a devil at the bottom who's always trying to outwit us, and it's only by some kind of a curious accident that we manage to survive, and even so we are not going to survive indefinitely. Now, this is of course a very dramatic picture, and there's some point to it, particularly when it's directed against the view that things in the world have been designed for the greater glory of man, and that there are no processes in nature which are inimical to the progress and the happiness of mankind. On the other hand, this kind of a picture of the world which imagines man as being constantly at war with nature, or perhaps the other way around, nature constantly at war with man seems to me to be a kind of inverted theology. Instead of regarding a beneficent power behind the scenes which operate things for the welfare of man, on the Russell picture, at least one part of that picture, thinks of a kind of a devil in place of a beneficent deity who operates things in order to make sport of the human scene. Now it seems to me that neither picture is an adequate one. That is, it isn't the case that everything in the universe has been designed for the happiness of man, but neither is it a mature view of man's place in nature to say, well, everything in nature is there in order to defeat human purposes. On the contrary, it is because we are able to discover what the patterns of behavior of various sorts of things in the universe are, that we can so organize them and reorganize our environment as to improve our lot. And it isn't because somebody's trying to spite us, but that we fail to do so, but frequently because of our ignorance. And as our ignorance is enlarged, we can eliminate many of the evils that our forefathers have had to suffer. The suffering is not the result of a deliberate malice on the part of some devil or demon. It is simply part of a neutral state of things. In a very important theorem in Spinoza's book on ethics, which he wrote in the fashion of a book on geometry, where he had certain axioms and then theorems. In the final book of his ethics, he has a theorem which says something like this: whoso truly loveth God, and by this he meant whoso really appreciates the order of nature, whoso truly loveth God would not wish God to love him in return. And the point is this, that the universe is, in one sense, indifferent. To suppose that it's either interested in enhancing the human scene or to destroy the human scene is to impute characteristics to nature as a whole which, in the light of the evidence, can be imputed to it. And it is a central feature of a thoroughgoing naturalism is to deny both extremes of this conception. So man's place in nature is that of any other thing in the universe, namely just as stars manage to maintain themselves because the local environment it makes it possible, just as molecules manage to maintain their individuality as long as certain circumstances are present, so human beings can maintain themselves when certain conditions are favorable to their maintenance. But if they don't manage to maintain themselves, it isn't because there's something that is spiteful that is going on. The second point I'd like to mention in this connection is that many philosophers in the past have taken the view that in order to regulate human life, one must in some way follow nature. This is a view that goes back at least some 2,000 years. It was a view that was held by the ancient Stoics, who tried to formulate certain moral doctrines for man, where the general principle was, well, always act so as to follow nature. Now, if you think of it, this is really a very ambiguous piece of advice, and if taken literally, it is absurd. We don't follow nature when we build houses, when we till the soil. That is, these are things that we manipulate in nature in order to enhance the quality of human life. The supposition that simply by observing nature we can decide what is a desirable form of life, what is a good form of life, is one which on little reflection indicates that we're not likely to get anywhere in this way, that one must really not look to nature as a whole, because nature as a whole has no purposes. We have to look to the human scene, to the human organism, discover what the impulses, what the desires, what the needs of human beings themselves are, and try to formulate rules of conduct, ideals of behavior, so as to establish some kind of a balance between the various impulses and needs and desires which human beings are capable of. In short, it would be a distinctive feature of naturalism, as I understand it, that it doesn't regard any impulse, any spring of action in human beings as being intrinsically either good or as bad. That if, for example, there was only one impulse that was manifested in man, then to satisfy that one impulse would be the sole good. The difficulty in moral questions arises from the fact that human beings have more than one impulse, have more than one spring of action. We have a desire to love and to be loved, to eat, to satisfy ambitions, to enjoy good health, and so on. One can continue this indefinitely. The difficulty is that many of our impulses are not compatible with one another, and the good life is one which enables us to establish some kind of a balance between these impulses in such a way that some sort of a harmony is established between them. So instead of supposing now that there are some impulses which are intrinsically good or intrinsically evil, a view which has become fairly fashionable today, that any action which in some way satisfies a need or a desire is therefore something that is to be regarded as desirable or as morally significant, is something which goes counter to an examination of the composition of the human life, of the human organism, of the complexity of desires which characterize human beings in different kinds of civilizations, and so that the supposition underlying a naturalistic view of what is the human good is the supposition that moral ideals are to be regarded as hypotheses, as tentative suggestions for achieving a balanced exercise of human powers. There is no one balance which is superior to all of them, to all the others. Different civilizations, different historical conditions might call for a different arrangement of the organization of human impulse. No ideal or no moral injunction is itself is self-evident and self-certifying. They are to be regarded as being soundly established when, in the repeated experience of human individuals, some kind of a stable satisfaction is achieved through the pursuit of some activities, through restraining or restricting others, and in this way hoping to establish something that will bring a lasting and deep satisfaction to those who follow this mode of conduct. Finally, let me say this: though on this view the thing that human beings value may vary from one society to another, from one individual to another, and even the best realized goals of human beings may not last indefinitely, it doesn't follow that because of the transitory character of the human scene, the transitory character of human goods, that the things that are valuable are therefore to be regarded as having no significance. That is, the duration of a human good itself is not a criterion of its value. And to suppose, for example, that the world is meaningless because human beings die, or because not all of our ambitions are realized, or because even those of our ambitions that are realized are not realized indefinitely and permanently, to suppose that the world is absurd and meaningless for this reason is again to make a demand upon the world which, on the basis of the analysis that millennia of human effort has contributed, which I've tried very briefly to summarize, indicate that this is really not a rational ideal. In short, now we'll have to stop here without considering some of the difficulties that have been laid at the door of naturalism. But naturalism does offer a rounded out view not only of a local part of the universe, but a total view of the scheme of things, kind of cosmic background against which human beings can order their lives and live a rational, live in a rational society. It supplies an indication of how adequate knowledge is to be obtained, and finally, it offers a conception of the nature of the human good such that it will not have a meretricious quality, but will enable us, in the light of such ideals as we can establish as being sound, live with a sense of dignity and of realization. Thank you very much.